Welcome back to Worth the Effort Woodworking, and today we are going to be going over 10 hand plane tips. Specifically, we're going to be working on technique tips. If you're actually looking for how to set up a hand plane or something like that, I have a video out there just for that. And if you're looking more for the differences between hand planes, I have a video right there for that one. This one is going to be talking about using hand planes, and more specifically, metal hand planes. If you like the difference between the metal and the wood ones, maybe that could be a future video. Leave a comment down below if you're interested in that. But today, 10 technique tips for using a metal hand plane. Now I'm going to give the first one to you as a bonus because it isn't really a technique tip and stuff like that. So here it is. If you're having any problems whatsoever with your hand planes, sharpen your blade. You're getting tear out, sharpen your blade. Your tool is hard to adjust, sharpen the blade. If your nosy neighbor is coming into the shop, sharpen the blades. But the very first step to solve a problem is to always sharpen your blades. Now after you've sharpened your blade and got it all reassembled, you're going to need to make adjustments on it. And I know a lot of people that make an adjustment, they will come over, take a shaving, make an adjustment, take a shaving. That just takes way too long. Plus, it doesn't give you as much control as if you were just to grab a little block. Now, whenever I cut tins, I save the little offcuts all the time because these little thin slivers are perfect for making plane adjustments. You can come over here, just kind of brace it with your body, and then you just bring your blade over. So as you can see, you can tell by both the feel of the blade going over the wood going over the blade, how thick a shaving you are getting, but where on the blade you want. And me personally, I like it to taper off on the edges. But if you have it if you taper the blade, but you're getting a heavy shaving on one side and no shaving on the other, you're still going to get plain tracks. And a lot of times testing out on the edge of a board doesn't tell you that kind of stuff. But if I'm coming over here, I can come over here and say, oh, that's a thick shaving. I'll back it off, then come forward a little bit. I'm not getting any shaving on this side, not getting much of a shaving on this side, but it starts to get a shaving on 2/3. So maybe I can adjust it, my thumb, a little bit. So now I'm getting a shaving in the middle, and it starts to taper off about a quarter way over. So that's how I can easily tell adjustments and fine tune it without having to go back and forth to the edge of a board. Now, I will say that that's just making an adjustment to get a very gossamer shavings, the kind you want when you're doing like smoothing work, just fluffy stuff. Total waste of time. More often than not, if you're wanting to get the work done, you want to be taking some shavings that are a little bit thicker. Now, that's a good shaving. That gets work done. But how can you tell how thick you're making a shaving by adjustments without having to take those test cuts? Well, that's tip 2. In the beginning, after every single adjustment with this, I want you to feel the blade. And not just in the middle, feel it all the way across. You're not going to cut yourself if you're going straight across. If you go side to side, yeah, you might cut yourself. But going straight across is just like shaving. It's not going to cut yourself. And I want you to start doing this every single time. And if you see professionals, they're doing this constantly, and they're making their adjustments that way. Because very quickly, you develop a feel for what a thousandths is, what 5/1000ths is, and that kind of stuff. So you can go back and forth even without coming to things like this. Plus the fact that by feeling it, you kind of can tell, hey, I got a little burr right here. I need to go back and sharpen and stuff like that. So tip number 2, after every single adjustment, get in the habit of feeling the blade to train your fingers. Tip number 3, when you're using a hand plane, always point your finger. Now that's not that hard to do if you have like a Bailey style plane, because most of the time the totes are designed so you can only get 3 fingers in here. So this hand finger has to point. But a lot of modern planes and stuff like that, they don't have that kind of stuff, and they make handles probably a little bit wrong. They need to make it so that your palm can fit right here, but that just kind of gives you more space where you could wrap that finger around. Now, why is it important not to use your index finger on the hand plane in this style? I challenge you not to put sideways force whenever you wrap your index finger around. It's just by human nature. All I'm doing is closing that. And you can see the force pushes a little bit of pressure on the sideways on the plane. Whereas if I'm sitting it right here, generally, as you hold it, you kind of are supporting it so you're not putting sideways pressure. I don't know what it is about the geometry of the hand, but that index wrap puts sideways pressures on your plane. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are there saying, oh, come on, Sean, it's not that much pressure out there. Well, think about how that much pressure would affect a golf swing or anything like that. That kind of stuff gets amplified, especially if you're jointing a board where you have a thin force on the out. Now, that might not be a lot of force over here, but the thing is, you've got a leverage action and you have weight hanging out on the outside that kind of amplifies it. So you could actually crush the fibers, especially on softer woods, by putting just the slightest amount of pressure on one side more than the other. So it affects how those boards would be glued up in the future. So do what your mama told you not to do. Point your finger. Next up, ignore the tote for any kind of work other than if the entire plane is sitting on a surface. So if you're jointing a board, you do not want to use a tote. If you're doing the end grain, you do not want to use a tote. The tote is only for large flat work. Why is that? Well, if you were to use the tote, you tend to put pressure leverage, kind of the same little thing right here, except it's a lot more. What you actually want to do is put your thumb right above whatever work you're doing on the blade and press down. That gives you a lot more even pressure. Now let me talk about what I mean by even pressure, because that is critical when you're jointing the edge of a board. So we have a thin board, okay? And we have a typical hand plane, 1 3/4 to 2 1/4 inches across. Quite a bit wider than most board edges. Well, I want you to think about the kind of leverage we can get on either side. That is important because on softer wood, you can easily plane the entire surface along the top, but put more pressure on one side, which crushes the fibers a little bit more, so you get an uneven joint. And if you do that one all the way across a board, well, maybe sometimes you put in pressure over here, some over there, so you get this kind of effect, even though it is dead straight, so you're not going to get the best glue line because, maybe some fibers aren't pressed up against each other, some fibers are crushed, therefore the oil or the finish you patch on it will highlight those areas differently. So if you are doing this and just the normal weight of a hand plane can affect it left or right, especially if you're using a camber blade, which I talked about those techniques in the other video, well, I want you to think about this. If you put your thumb right there, your pressure can come way far out and still be over the board. But if you have a tote and your pressure is up here on the tote, well, look at the angle of force. If you're putting pressure on the tote, you as a user have to be perfect in getting your force going straight down. But if you have your thumb on it, your force can be going that far over and it's still going to be focused on top of the board, not the edges. There's just a lot more room for error with torque if you put your thumb on the bed and don't use the knob. Next up, I want to talk about using a finger fence, because if you're jointing, the plane is not covering the board is not covering the entire plane. So you need something to keep the board going over one specific portion of your blade. It might be you have a camber on your blade, and that will affect the jointing. And that is actually how I prefer to do my planes, and I talk about that in the other videos. So I need my finger to be a fence to control where the board is working out. But when you're doing that, you kind of want to watch out for certain things, specifically splinters. Okay, so when you're going to joint a board, you put your plane down in here, you got your thumb, you put it right over the board. Now, if you're working off the side of the plane, once again, you put it over the board. All your pressure down comes from your thumb over on the side, and that keeps the plane flat. But if you're just moving forward, and then you'll notice I will put my finger down right underneath, and that keeps the plane in that area. If I want it over on the side, my finger, and I can keep the plane in that area of the blade. Fairly simple, right? But if you notice, you got a very sharp edge right here, and sometimes it kind of breaks off on the edge. So if you notice, while I might have a lot of pressure down here, I don't have much pressure on the fence. I'm basically just gliding over it, and because your finger is a bit round when you're not brushing it in there, you have a little bit of a gap between the edge and that right there. So any splinters that might be hanging down or could catch your finger aren't going to be there. So pressure with the thumb, very light on the finger, and voila, you got the perfect finger fence. And by focusing on that heavy on the thumb, light on the finger, you're not inducing any sideways torque. Now, I find there are a lot of recurring themes in woodworking, footwork being one of them. Now, when I'm turning a bowl, I generally like to position my body in one place so I can get all the way around the bowl in the other place without moving my feet. Because once you introduce a shuffle, your whole body mechanics changes. So you apply pressure differently and you get minute curvature changes in bowl turning. Well, the same thing is kind of what happens when you're hand planing. Every time you move your feet, things change. And obviously I'm exaggerating a little bit. So whenever you're jointing a long board, try to position your body so that you don't have to move your feet. If the board's long enough that you do, basically what I will do is I will lock my body and then I will walk as smooth as possible, not moving my upper arm. But if I can get away with not moving my feet, what I want to do is I want to position my feet so that I can come from one side all the way to the other without changing my feet. So right now I'm too far back, so I can now come back over and cover the entire board. You ever wonder why a lot of workbenches are 6, 7, 8 feet long? Because that's kind of the reach of a lot of woodworkers. So here we go, getting the rough shavings done. I also find doing this right here, it looks like I'm doing a lot more movement, but I tire a lot less doing it like this. It's just shifting your weight around. Now that I got the rough work done, I return to my proper techniques where I got my weight right over the board. This time instead of using my thumb, I'm using my palm, just pressing through. Now this was an extreme example, but if you're just doing, the typical cabinet-sized board, well, just this much movement is all you need. You don't need to take a step. A step will ruin your consistency. Now here's something I do quite a bit when I am jointing a very long board for the simple reason I don't want that transition to go out there. And even though I'm making it as smooth as possible, I'm never really perfect. But if I can put a board on a table raised up just a tad bit, well, getting it up off of it basically allows me to ignore that bottom edge of the blade, and the higher you get it up, you can actually position it so it's somewhat in the middle of your hand plane. So if you're using one hand plane, just keep a couple shims underneath your bench that are that height to get positioned perfectly. And now I basically eliminated all the problems I could induce by using the Tote instead of my thumb, torquing around, because I can just put the plane on its side and run it along that way. Now, most modern planes are machined pretty much at 90 degrees, but some of the older ones, you know, you might be at 88, 89, 92, something like that. Well, if you adjust your blade this way and that way, that will make a minor adjustment on the angle. And it's one of those things that in this situation, a big adjustment on your blade makes a minor adjustment on the angle, so you have a lot of lateral wiggle room. And after that, jointing just becomes a matter of running your plane along your workbench. It keeps it at a constant angle all the way down. My next tip is going to piss off a lot of public school teachers. But when you're working the face of a board, for example, this large tabletop, whether you're flattening it or smoothing it or anything like that, don't pick up your plane. Drag it back. Now, I know a lot of y'all just cringed when you saw me do that one because you say, you're dulling the blade. Well, here's my thinking. I'm about to shove this thing through a board going forward. You don't think that's dulling the blade more than simply dragging it back? Shoot, that way I'm probably burnishing the blade so you make it even sharper, right? No. It's idiotic to me. I know how to sharpen a blade. It doesn't take but 15 to 30 seconds most of the time. It's not that big a deal. Our entire purpose as woodworkers is to dull blades. But every time you pick up a plane, you have to be perfectly precise when you set it down. If you set down one corner more than the other, I just dented my tabletop. Especially in soft boards, pines, poplars, you know, some even mesquite. And everyone thinks mesquite's hard because it dulls your tools fast, but that's just because it has a lot of silica in it. You can stick your thumbnail into mesquite. That's how soft it is. So if you are not perfect, you just created more work for yourself. But if you drag it back, you don't risk that. You create more work for yourself, maybe, because you have to sharpen it. But no risk of dents that you have to plane out later on. Now, in addition to feeling the blade, I want you to get in a habit periodically while you're working of doing this, like that, okay? I want you to feel all the edges. I want you to feel the bottom surface with your hand. Sometimes you can develop things like, if you're doing pine and stuff like that, you get a little pitch on there that will kind of press down in one area, and you'll get grooves that you won't notice until you apply finish because those fibers are crushed. But a lot of times I find that I get little burrs on the edges of my plane, and I'm constantly having to plane them out, but I end up just creating more. By just dragging your hand across it, you go, oh, I must have hit a piece of sand, or maybe that bark inclusion nicked the blade a little. Remember, this is ductile iron. This is not the strongest stuff. This is not harder than the blades themselves. It's actually softer. And if you're dulling the blade, you know you're scratching and nicking the edges of your hand plane. So just get in the habit. You know, you're doing, just run your hand like that. It's no big deal, but it will tell you so much about the plane's state of tune. And your last tip, if you're adding a chamfer to the sides or edge of a board, I see so many people do this and the results is not as clean, okay? You do not want to chamfer going sideways like that, okay? Because you're putting a lot of force against end grain and you're going to get tear out, breakage, that kind of stuff, and plus you're not going to get as smooth a surface. If you want to chamfer end grain, drop your plane blade down so that it's going to cut the fiber low and pitch the fiber high. So it pushes it off this way. You're going to get curls that way. That does two things. It gives you a smoother cut because in effect you have lowered the angle of the blade, but that tear out, that flecking you get on the side, it doesn't happen as much because you've already cut the fiber low, and so it's not getting leverage to crack it down below. So the action is sideways. It's skewed. Chamfer with a skew. Well, there you go. I hope at least one or two of those were new to you. Or if they weren't, you now understand why. Because understanding why you do something, a certain technique, means that you can now apply it to other tools. For example, when I applied turning skills to a hand plane skills. Again, I hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, please like, favorite, subscribe, do all those social medias for us. And I want to leave you with one last tip, that it's always worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. Y'all be safe and have fun.